The GoodKnight Stories, The Field of Honour. A Chronicle of Agincourt, October 25th, 1415. The silver-armoured knight stood at the edge of the world he knew, watching the mist rise from the sodden fields of northern France. His breath formed small clouds in the cold morning air of October 25th, 1415. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the veil of fog and rain, lay an army that outnumbered his own by perhaps 3 to 1. He had been here before, not at this exact place, but in moments like this. Moments where the weight of steel pressed against his shoulders, where the familiar grip of his sword felt both comforting and insufficient, where the silence before battle stretched like a held breath across the countryside. But this morning felt different. This morning, something in the air itself seemed to whisper of change. The knight's silver armour caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky, each plate carefully maintained despite the grueling march from Harfleur. 2.5 weeks they had walked, 260 miles through hostile territory, their numbers already decimated by disease and exhaustion. The bloody flux had claimed nearly 1/3 of their force before they'd even left the captured port. Dysentery, malaria, the slow wasting that came from bad water and worse food. He had watched good men die, not from French steel, but from their own bodies betraying them in foreign soil. Yet here they stood. Here he had stood, as he always had, as he always would. The field before them was a nightmare of churned earth and standing water. Days of relentless rain had transformed what should have been solid ground into a treacherous bog. The freshly ploughed furrows, already soft from the autumn weather, had become channels of thick, clinging mud that would trap a man's feet and hold them fast. He could see where the French had exercised their horses the day before, their hooves cutting deep gouges that now filled with murky water. Behind him, the English army stirred with the quiet efficiency of professional soldiers. These were not the feudal levies of old, bound by oath and obligation alone. These were men who had signed contracts, who fought for coin as much as crown, who understood that their survival depended not on individual glory, but on collective discipline. The indenture system had changed everything, transformed warfare from a seasonal obligation of the nobility into a year-round profession for those skilled enough to survive it. The knight adjusted his grip on his sword hilt, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon at his side. His lance stood planted in the soft earth nearby, its steel point gleaming dully in the grey light. Around him, his fellow men-at-arms made their own quiet preparations, checking straps, testing the flex of their armour, murmuring brief prayers to saints whose names had been worn smooth by countless repetitions. But it was the archers who truly defined this army. Nearly 4,000 of them, English and Welsh longbowmen, whose weapons had already proven their worth at Crécy and Poitiers. Their bows stood taller than most men, carved from yew and capable of sending a bodkin point through steel plate at close range. Each archer carried a sheaf of arrows, 24 shafts that could be loosed with deadly precision at a rate that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The knight had fought alongside these men before, had seen what their combined volleys could do to a charging line of cavalry. The sound alone was terrifying, the deep thrum of 4,000 bowstrings releasing in near unison. followed by the whistle of arrows cutting through air, then the screams of horses and the crash of armored bodies hitting the ground. It was a sound that haunted dreams and broke the courage of even veteran warriors. King Henry moved among them now, his presence both calming and electric. The knight could see him in the distance, speaking quietly with his captains, his own armor polished to a mirror shine despite the conditions. Henry was young, not yet 30, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His decision to march to Calais rather than retreat directly to England had been bold to the point of recklessness, but it had also been brilliant. It had forced this confrontation, this moment where everything would be decided. The French were stirring now, their banners becoming visible through the mist. The knight could make out the movement of mounted figures, the glint of steel, the proud heraldry of some of the greatest names in France. They would be confident, these French knights. They had every reason to be. Their army was larger, better supplied, fighting on their own soil. Their heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields for generations. Their plate armor was the finest that money could buy, crafted by the most skilled armorers in Christendom. But they would have to cross that field of mud to reach the English line. The knight's thoughts turned to the night just past. Henry had demanded absolute silence from his troops, threatening severe punishment for any man who broke discipline. Knights and men-at-arms faced the loss of their horses and harness, a financial catastrophe that could ruin a man's career. Common soldiers risked losing an ear, a permanent mark of shame that would follow them for life. The threat had been effective. The English camp had been as quiet as a monastery, while across the field the French had spent the night in revelry, their confidence echoing across the muddy ground in the form of laughter and song. Now, as dawn broke grey and cold over the battlefield, that confidence would be tested. The knight could feel the familiar tightening in his chest that came before battle. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that made every sensation more vivid. The weight of his armor, the sound of his own breathing, the smell of wet earth and steel, and the sweat of nervous horses. His destrier stood nearby, but he would not mount today. The English way was to fight on foot, to present a solid wall of steel that could not be broken by cavalry charge. It was a lesson learned through hard experience, refined through decades of warfare against enemies who still believed in the supremacy of the mounted knight. The French would learn differently today. A horn sounded in the distance, not English but French. The enemy was beginning to move, their great army stirring like some massive beast awakening from sleep. The knight could see the glitter of their armor now, the proud banners of their nobility, the forest of lance points that caught what little light penetrated the overcast sky. They would advance in the traditional manner, heavy cavalry in the van, supported by crossbowmen and men-at-arms, confident in their ability to sweep the smaller English force from the field. But tradition, the knight reflected, was about to meet innovation. The English archers were already in position, their stakes driven deep into the soft ground before them. These sharpened wooden spikes, angled toward the enemy, would channel any cavalry charge into killing zones where the longbows could do their work most effectively. It was a simple innovation, but like many simple things, it was devastatingly effective. The knight's own position was in the centre of the English line, part of the solid core of men-at-arms that would anchor the entire formation. To his left and right stood men he had fought beside before, professional soldiers who understood that their survival depended on maintaining formation, on presenting an unbreakable front to whatever the French might send against them. They were dismounted by choice, not necessity, their horses held in reserve behind the lines where they could be used for pursuit if the battle went well, or for escape if it went badly. The morning air carried the sound of French voices now, the commands of officers organizing their formations, the creak of leather and the jingle of mail. The knight could make out individual figures among the enemy, great lords whose names were known throughout Europe, whose ransoms would be worth fortunes if they could be taken alive. But that was a concern for later. First, they had to survive the charge. Henry's voice cut through the morning air, clear and strong despite the distance. The knight could not make out the words, but he could hear the tone, confident, inspiring, the voice of a king who believed absolutely in his cause and his men. It was a voice that had carried them through the siege of Harfleur, through the grueling march across Normandy, through the long night of waiting that had just ended. The French were forming up now, their cavalry moving into position for the charge that would decide everything. The knight could see the great destriers, bred for war and trained to strike with hoof and teeth, as well as to carry their armoured riders into battle. He could see the lances, 12 feet of ash tipped with steel, designed to punch through armour and flesh with the combined weight of horse and rider behind them. He could see the confidence in their bearing, the certainty that this would be another Crécy, another Poitiers. But this time, the French would be ready. They were not ready for what was coming. The knight's hand found the pommel of his sword again, a gesture so automatic he was barely aware of it. The weapon had been with him for longer than he cared to remember, its blade nicked and scarred from countless battles, its grip worn smooth by his gauntleted hands. It was not the finest sword ever forged, but it was his, and it had never failed him when he needed it most. Around him, the English line was settling into its final formation. The archers had their arrows nocked, their bowstraves bent just enough to maintain tension without tiring their arms. The men-at-arms had their shields ready, their weapons loose in their sheaths. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood what was expected of them. It was the product of years of campaigning together, of shared hardship and mutual dependence that had forged them into something more than the sum of their parts. The French horn sounded again, closer now, and the knight could feel the ground beginning to tremble under the hooves of their cavalry. It was starting, the moment that would determine not just the fate of this battle, but perhaps the course of the war itself. Henry's gamble was about to be tested against the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, and there would be no second chances. The knight took a deep breath, tasting the cold morning air, and prepared to discover whether English innovation could triumph over French tradition, whether discipline could overcome numbers, whether the muddy field before them would become a graveyard for chivalry, or a monument to its enduring power. The silver of his armor caught the light one more time as he raised his sword, and across the field the French began their charge. The thunder began as a distant rumble, felt more than heard through the soles of his feet. The knight had experienced cavalry charges before, but never quite like this. Never with the ground itself conspiring against the attackers, never with such perfect conditions for the defense. The French heavy cavalry was magnificent in its initial advance, a wall of steel and horseflesh that would have broken lesser armies through sheer intimidation alone. But magnificence, the knight had learned, was often the enemy of effectiveness. The first rank of French knights came on at a measured pace, their great destriers picking their way carefully through the churned earth. These were not the wild, headlong charges of romance and song, but the calculated advance of professional warriors who understood the value of maintaining formation. Their lances were leveled, their shields positioned to deflect arrows, their armor gleaming despite the overcast sky. Behind them came rank after rank of mounted nobility, the flower of French chivalry arrayed in all its deadly splendor. The knight could see individual faces now beneath the raised visors, young men and old veterans of a dozen campaigns, and knights riding to their first major battle. Some bore the scars of previous encounters, others showed the unmarked confidence of those who had never known defeat. All of them shared the same expression of grim determination, the look of men who believed absolutely in their cause and their ability to achieve it. The English line remained motionless, a thin barrier of steel and flesh that seemed impossibly fragile against the approaching tide. But the knight knew better. He had seen what disciplined infantry could accomplish when properly positioned and led. He had watched cavalry charges break like waves against well-prepared defenses, had seen the finest heavy horse in Europe reduced to struggling, wounded animals trapped in terrain that negated all their advantages. The archers were waiting, their bowstreves drawn but not yet at full extension. 4,000 men with weapons that could loose 12 arrows per minute, each shaft capable of punching through mail at close range, of finding the gaps in plate armor, of bringing down the great war horses that were as much weapons as the men who rode them. The knight could feel their tension, their readiness, their absolute confidence in their ability to do what they had been trained to do. The French were closer now, close enough that he could hear the labored breathing of their horses, the creak of leather and the jingle of harness. The ground was working against them with every step, the soft earth and standing water sapping the strength from their mounts, disrupting the careful formations they had spent years perfecting. What should have been a thunderous charge was becoming a labored advance, each stride more difficult than the last. The knight's thoughts turned to the men around him, professional soldiers who had chosen this life, who had signed contracts and taken coin to stand in this muddy field and face the finest cavalry in Europe. They were not here because of feudal obligation or family honor, though those things mattered. They were here because they were good at what they did, because they had proven themselves in battle after battle, because they understood that their skill with weapons was a commodity that kings would pay handsomely to possess. The indenture system had changed everything about warfare. Where once armies had been raised through feudal levy, with all the complications and limitations that entailed, now captains contracted directly with the crown to provide specific numbers of troops with defined capabilities. It was more efficient, more reliable, and it created a class of professional soldiers who fought not just for glory or obligation, but for the tangible rewards that success could bring. The knight himself was part of this new order. His armor, his weapons, his very presence on this field represented an investment in training, in equipment, in the accumulated experience of years of campaigning. He was not just a warrior, but a military professional whose survival and success had direct economic implications for himself and his retainers. The French charge was faltering now, their horses struggling in the deepening mud, their formation beginning to compress as the lead ranks slowed, and those behind pressed forward. The knight could see the frustration on their faces, the growing realization that this was not going to be the swift, decisive victory they had anticipated. The terrain that should have been their ally was becoming their enemy, the very ground beneath their horses' hooves, conspiring to rob them of momentum and cohesion. And still the English archers waited. The knight knew what they were waiting for, the perfect moment when the French would be close enough for maximum effect, but still far enough away to allow for multiple volleys. It was a calculation born of experience, refined through countless battles, perfected through the hard-won knowledge of what worked and what did not. The longbow was not just a weapon but a system, and like all systems, it required precise timing to achieve maximum effectiveness. The French were within 100 yards now, their horses laboring through mud that reached nearly to their fetlocks. The proud banners that had fluttered so bravely at the start of the charge now hung limp in the still air, weighed down by moisture and the growing sense that something was going terribly wrong. Individual knights were beginning to fall behind as their mounts struggled with the conditions, the perfect line of the charge dissolving into a ragged advance that bore little resemblance to the textbook maneuver they had intended. The knight could hear King Henry's voice now, clear and commanding despite the distance. The words were lost in the general noise of the approaching battle, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm, confident, the voice of a leader who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. Henry had gambled everything on this battle, had risked his army and his kingdom on the belief that English tactics and English courage could overcome French numbers and French tradition. The gamble was about to be tested. The first flight of arrows rose from the English line like a dark cloud, 4,000 shafts arcing high into the grey sky before descending toward the struggling French cavalry. The knight watched their flight with professional interest, noting the tight grouping that spoke of disciplined training, the way they seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment before gravity claimed them and sent them earthward with deadly purpose. The sound of their impact was unlike anything in the natural world, a combination of thuds and screams and the crash of armored bodies hitting the ground that seemed to go on forever. Horses reared and fell, their riders thrown clear or trapped beneath their weight. Knights who had ridden to battle in perfect confidence found themselves struggling in the mud, their heavy armor becoming a liability rather than an asset, their mobility reduced to a desperate crawl through the clinging earth. But the charge continued. The French were nothing if not brave, and those who could still advance pressed forward, their lances still leveled, their determination unshaken despite the carnage around them. They had faced English arrows before at Crécy and Poitiers, had learned to accept casualties as the price of closing with their enemies. They would not be turned back by a single volley, no matter how devastating. The second flight was already in the air before the first had finished its work, and then the third and the fourth. The English archers were shooting as fast as they could draw and loose, their movements economical and precise, each man a part of a larger machine designed for the efficient delivery of death at range. The knight could see the French formation disintegrating under the relentless barrage, individual knights and their mounts falling in growing numbers, the survivors pressing forward through an increasingly deadly gauntlet. Some of the French cavalry had broken off from the main charge, attempting to circle around the flanks where they might find easier going. But the English had anticipated this as well, positioning their archers to cover the approaches and driving their stakes deep into the ground to channel any attack into predetermined killing zones. It was not just tactics but engineering, the careful application of terrain and obstacles to maximize the effectiveness of their weapons. The knight's own role in this carefully orchestrated destruction was still to come. The archers would do their work, would thin the French ranks and disrupt their formations, but eventually some of the enemy would reach the English line. When that happened, it would be up to the men-at-arms to hold firm, to present an unbreakable wall of steel that could absorb the impact of the charge and then strike back with disciplined ferocity. He could see them coming now, individual French knights who had somehow survived the arrow storm, their horses blown and exhausted, but still carrying them forward through sheer determination. Their armor was dented and scarred, their lances splintered or lost, but they came on anyway, driven by courage and desperation in equal measure. These were the survivors, the lucky ones, the men who had somehow navigated the killing ground and lived to reach the English line. They would find no mercy there. The knight raised his sword, feeling the familiar weight of the blade in his hand, and prepared to meet them. Around him, his fellow men-at-arms did the same, their weapons gleaming in the grey light, their faces set with the grim determination of professional soldiers who understood exactly what was required of them. They had trained for this moment, had drilled the movements until they were automatic, had learned to fight as a unit rather than as individuals. The first French knight to reach their line came on at a stumbling gallop, his destriers' hooves slipping and sliding in the treacherous mud. His lance was gone, lost somewhere in the arrow storm, but he had drawn his sword and was raising it for a strike that would never land. 3 English men-at-arms moved to meet him, their own weapons coordinated in a pattern that left no room for individual heroics, no space for the kind of single combat that had defined warfare for generations. The French knight went down hard, his horse collapsing beneath him, and the knight in silver armor stepped forward to deliver the killing blow. It was not glorious, not the stuff of songs and stories, but it was effective, it was professional, it was the new way of war, where survival mattered more than honor, where victory was achieved through discipline and coordination rather than individual prowess. More French knights were reaching the line now, their attacks uncoordinated and desperate, their formations completely broken by the combination of terrain and archery. They fought with the courage of lions, but they fought alone, each man isolated from his comrades by the chaos of the battlefield, each attack met by multiple defenders who had trained to fight as a team. The knight found himself engaged with a French nobleman whose surcoat bore arms he did not recognize. 3 golden fleur-de-lis on a field of blue, the heraldry of some great house, whose name would die with its bearer in this muddy field. The Frenchman was skilled, his sword-work polished and precise despite his exhaustion, but he was fighting on foot in armor designed for mounted combat, struggling with footing that gave him no purchase, facing an enemy who had chosen this ground and prepared for this moment. Their blades met with a ringing crash that echoed across the battlefield, steel against steel in the ancient dance of combat. The French knight was strong, his strikes powerful enough to dent armor and break bones, but the English knight was fresher, his movements more economical, his position more secure. He had not spent the morning struggling through knee-deep mud, had not endured the arrow storm that had claimed so many of his enemies, had not watched his carefully planned charge dissolve into chaos and slaughter. The fight was brief and brutal, ending when the French knight's foot slipped in the treacherous mud and left him open for a thrust that found the gap between breastplate and helmet. He went down without a sound, his blood mixing with the rain and mud that had already claimed so many others, his death unmarked except by the English knight who stepped over his body and looked for the next threat. But there were fewer threats now. The French charge had spent itself against the English line like a wave against a sea-wall, its force dissipated by terrain and archery and the disciplined resistance of professional soldiers who had prepared for exactly this moment. Individual French knights still fought with desperate courage, but they were isolated now, cut off from support, facing enemies who outnumbered them and held every advantage. The knight could see King Henry in the thick of the fighting, his royal surcoat bright against the grey morning, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. Part of the crown had been knocked from his helmet. But he fought on, leading by example, showing his men that even kings could dirty their hands in the brutal work of war. It was leadership of a different kind than the remote majesty of earlier monarchs, more personal and immediate, more suited to an age where professional soldiers expected their commanders to share their risks. The battle was turning into a rout now, the surviving French cavalry streaming back across the muddy field, their retreat as disorganized as their advance had become. But the knight knew this was only the beginning. The French had more troops in reserve, more knights and men-at-arms who had not yet been committed to the fight. This first repulse was a victory, but it was not yet the victory that would decide the day. The English archers were already reaching for fresh arrows, their quivers still heavy despite the volleys they had loosed. The men-at-arms were checking their weapons and armor, looking for damage that might compromise their effectiveness in the fighting to come. Everyone understood that this was just the first act of a longer drama, that the French would regroup and attack again, that the real test was still ahead. But they had proven something important in these first minutes of combat. They had shown that English tactics could work against French tradition, that discipline could triumph over individual courage, that the new way of war was superior to the old. The knight felt a surge of professional satisfaction as he cleaned his blade and prepared for whatever came next. The field before them was littered with French dead and wounded, their bright surcoats now stained with mud and blood, their proud banners trampled into the earth. It was a sight that would have been unthinkable just hours before, when the French had seemed so confident, so overwhelming in their numbers and their certainty of victory. Now they knew better. Now they understood what they were truly facing. The knight adjusted his grip on his sword and waited for the next attack, his silver armor gleaming in the pale morning light, his eyes fixed on the distant French lines where new formations were already beginning to take shape. The battle was far from over, but the first lesson had been taught and learned. The age of the mounted knight was ending, and the age of the professional soldier had begun. The lull that followed the first French repulse was deceptive in its quietude. Across the muddy field, the wounded cried out in languages that pain made universal, while the dead lay silent in poses that spoke of violence and desperation. The knight in silver armor used these precious minutes to assess the damage to his own forces, to check on the men around him, to prepare for what he knew must come next. The English line had held, but it had not held without cost. Several men-at-arms bore wounds that would need attention, their armor dented and scarred from the brief but vicious melee. One young knight, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, sat heavily against a stake, his left arm hanging useless at his side, his face pale with shock and blood loss. The knight had seen that look before, the expression of a man discovering that war was nothing like the songs made it seem. "Bind that tight," he told the boy's squire, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Keep pressure on it until the bleeding stops." The squire nodded frantically, his own hands shaking as he worked to staunch the wound. These were the moments that separated veterans from novices, not the grand gestures of combat, but the small acts of competence that kept men alive when steel had done its work. The archers were already preparing for the next assault, their movements efficient and practiced. Those who had expended their arrows were retrieving what shafts they could from the field, pulling them from French corpses and wounded horses with the casual professionalism of men who understood that ammunition was a finite resource. Others were checking their bowstraves for damage, testing the tension, ensuring that their weapons would not fail them when they were needed most. The knight watched a Welsh archer work his way methodically through a cluster of French dead, his movements quick and economical. The man's face showed no emotion as he went about his grisly task. This was simply part of the job, as necessary as stringing his bow or fletching his arrows. War had its own economy, and nothing could be wasted, especially not the tools that might mean the difference between victory and defeat. King Henry was moving among his troops now, his presence both calming and energizing. The knight could see him speaking with individual soldiers, checking on the wounded, offering words of encouragement to those who needed them. It was a different kind of kingship than the remote majesty of earlier monarchs, more personal, more immediate, more suited to an age where professional soldiers expected their commanders to share their dangers. "How do you fare?" Henry asked as he approached the knight's position, his voice carrying genuine concern despite the formal phrasing. The king's own armor bore the marks of combat, fresh scratches on the breastplate, a dent in the shoulder-piece where a French mace had found its mark. Part of his crown had indeed been knocked away during the fighting, but he wore the damage like a badge of honor. "Well enough, your grace," the knight replied, inclining his head in acknowledgment. The line held firm. The men fought well. It was a simple report, but it carried weight. In the new professional army, competence was currency, and the knight's calm assessment spoke of experience and reliability. Henry nodded, his eyes already moving to assess the next section of the line. "They'll come again soon," he said, more to himself than to the knight. "They have to. They cannot afford to let this stand." It was the voice of a commander who understood his enemies as well as his own forces, who could read the tactical situation with the clarity that came from years of study and experience. The king was right, of course. The French could not simply withdraw after such a repulse. Their honor demanded another attempt, their strategic situation required it, and their numerical superiority made it seem feasible despite the disaster of the first charge. But the knight wondered if they truly understood what they were facing, if they grasped the fundamental changes that had transformed warfare in the past generation. The French were still thinking in terms of individual prowess and mounted shock action, still believing that courage and noble blood could overcome tactical innovation and professional discipline. They had learned nothing from Crécy, nothing from Poitiers, nothing from the countless smaller engagements where English longbows had proven their worth against traditional cavalry. They would attack again because they could not conceive of any alternative, because their entire worldview depended on the supremacy of the mounted knight. The knight could see them now, reforming in the distance, their banners once again proud and defiant, despite the carnage that littered the field between the armies. Fresh troops were moving forward, men who had not yet felt the sting of English arrows, who had not yet struggled through the clinging mud, who still believed in the invincibility of French arms. They would learn as their comrades had learned, but the lesson would be written in blood and suffering. The second French formation was larger than the first, incorporating not just heavy cavalry, but also crossbowmen and men-at-arms on foot. It was a more balanced approach, one that showed some understanding of the tactical realities they faced. But it was also more cumbersome, more difficult to coordinate, more vulnerable to the kind of disruption that English archery could provide. The knight checked his own equipment one more time. Sword loose in its sheath, dagger secure at his belt, armor straps tight and properly adjusted. His shield bore fresh scars from the first engagement, but it was still sound, still capable of turning a blade or absorbing the impact of a mace. Everything was as ready as it could be, which meant that now there was nothing to do but wait and watch as the French prepared to repeat their mistake on a larger scale. The archers had finished their preparations and were back in position, their arrows nocked, their faces set with the grim concentration of professionals about to practice their trade. The knight could feel their confidence, their absolute certainty in their ability to do what was required of them. They had proven themselves in the first exchange, had demonstrated once again that the longbow was the master of the medieval battlefield when properly employed. The French advance began with more caution this time, their commanders having learned at least something from the disaster of the first charge. The cavalry moved more slowly, trying to maintain formation despite the treacherous footing, while the crossbowmen attempted to provide covering fire. But crossbows were slow to reload, and their effective range was shorter than that of the English longbows. The exchange of missile fire was brief and decidedly one-sided. The knight watched the familiar pattern unfold, the dark cloud of English arrows rising into the grey sky, the screams of wounded horses, the crash of armoured bodies hitting the muddy ground. But this time there were more targets, more French troops struggling forward through the killing ground, more individual acts of courage and desperation playing out against the backdrop of tactical disaster. A French crossbowman, his weapon lost or broken, drew a long knife and charged directly at the English line with a cry that was part war shout and part death scream. He made it perhaps 20 yards before 3 arrows took him down, but his courage was undeniable, his commitment absolute. The knight felt a moment of professional respect for the man's bravery, even as he recognized the futility of the gesture. The main body of French cavalry was struggling forward now, their horses laboring through mud that seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. The field had become a quagmire that negated every advantage the French possessed. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they could only advance in a narrow front. Their heavy armor became a liability when they were unhorsed and forced to fight on foot in the clinging earth. Individual French knights were beginning to reach the English line again, but they arrived piecemeal, exhausted and disorganized, facing fresh enemies who had chosen their ground and prepared their defenses. The knight found himself engaged with a massive French man-at-arms whose surcoat bore the arms of Burgundy, a formidable opponent under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. The Frenchman's first swing was powerful enough to dent steel, but it was also slow and telegraphed, the product of exhaustion and desperation rather than skill. The knight sidestepped easily, his own counterattack finding the gap between helmet and gorget with surgical precision. The big man went down hard, his fall shaking the ground, his death adding one more body to the growing pile of French casualties. But even as individual French knights fell, more kept coming. Their courage was magnificent and terrible, their determination unshakable despite the mounting evidence that their cause was hopeless. They fought with the fury of men who knew they were dying, who understood that their world was ending with them, who refused to go quietly into the darkness that was claiming their entire way of life. The knight found himself thinking of the broader implications as he fought. This was not just a battle between two armies, but a collision between two different concepts of warfare, two different understandings of what it meant to be a soldier. The French represented the old way, individual prowess, noble blood, the supremacy of the mounted warrior. The English embodied the new, professional competence, tactical innovation, the power of disciplined cooperation. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The French attacks were growing weaker, less coordinated, more desperate. Their reserves were being fed piecemeal into a battle they could not win, their casualties mounting with each failed assault. The English line held firm, anchored by men who understood their role and executed it with professional precision. King Henry was still in the thick of the fighting, his sword work as economical and effective as any common soldier's. The knight could see him engaging a French nobleman whose elaborate armor marked him as a man of high rank and considerable wealth. The fight was brief, but vicious, ending when Henry's blade found the joint at the Frenchman's elbow and sent him crashing to the muddy ground. The sight of their king fighting alongside them, sharing their dangers and their triumphs, had a profound effect on the English troops. This was leadership of a new kind, more personal and immediate than the remote majesty of earlier monarchs. Henry was not just commanding the battle, he was participating in it, proving by his actions that he was worthy of the loyalty his men gave him. The French were beginning to break now, their formations dissolving under the relentless pressure of English archery and the stubborn resistance of the men-at-arms. Individual knights still fought with desperate courage, but they were isolated, cut off from support, facing enemies who outnumbered them and held every advantage. The retreat, when it came, was as disorganized as the advance had been. But the knight knew that this was still not the end. The French had more troops in reserve, more nobles who had not yet committed themselves to the battle, more resources to draw upon. They would regroup. They would attack again, and each assault would be more desperate than the last, as they realized that their traditional advantages meant nothing in this muddy field, where English innovation had turned warfare on its head. The lull that followed the second repulse was longer than the first, filled with the sounds of wounded men and dying horses, punctuated by the occasional cry of a French herald calling for the recovery of noble bodies. The English used the time to tend their own wounded, to redistribute arrows, to prepare for what everyone knew must be the final act of this bloody drama. The knight cleaned his blade again, noting the fresh nicks in the steel, the way the edge had been dulled by contact with French armor. It was still a good weapon, still capable of doing what was required, but it bore the marks of hard use. Like everything else on this field, it had been tested and proven, scarred but not broken by the demands placed upon it. The third French attack, when it came, would be different from the first two. The knight could sense it in the way they were forming up, in the desperate energy of their preparations, in the knowledge that this might be their last chance to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen them. They would throw everything they had left into one final desperate assault, hoping that sheer weight of numbers could accomplish what skill and courage had failed to achieve. The knight adjusted his grip on his sword and prepared to meet them, his silver armor gleaming in the pale afternoon light, his eyes fixed on the distant French lines where the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. The battle had already proven everything that needed proving, had already demonstrated the superiority of the new way of war over the old. But the French would not accept that lesson easily. They would fight to the end, as was their nature and their honor, and the knight would be there to meet them, as was his duty and his profession. The age of chivalry was dying in the mud of Agincourt, but it would not die quietly. The third French assault came not with the proud confidence of the first charge, nor with the grim determination of the second, but with the desperate fury of men who understood that everything they had ever believed about warfare, about honor, about their place in the world, was crumbling beneath their feet. The knight in silver armor watched them form up in the distance, and knew that this final attack would be the most dangerous of all. Not because the French had found some new tactical advantage, but because desperate men fought with a ferocity that could overcome even the most careful preparations. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the battlefield that was already littered with the debris of 2 failed assaults. The mud had grown deeper, churned by thousands of hooves and feet into a treacherous bog that claimed boots and sometimes entire legs of those who ventured into it. The smell of blood and death hung heavy in the air, mixed with the acrid scent of wet steel and the earthier odors of churned soil and frightened horses. This time, the French came on foot as well as mounted, having finally grasped that their cavalry alone could not break the English line. Men-at-arms in the finest plate armor available struggled forward through the clinging mud, their movements hampered by the weight of their protection, but their determination undiminished. Behind them came more crossbowmen, their weapons held high to keep them clear of the mire, their faces set with the grim knowledge that they were walking into a storm of English arrows. The knight could see individual faces now among the advancing French, young men and old veterans scarred by previous battles and knights who had never known defeat. Some bore the arms of the greatest houses in France, their surcoats displaying heraldry that spoke of centuries of noble lineage and military tradition. Others were simple men-at-arms, professional soldiers not unlike the English they faced, bound by contract and coin rather than feudal obligation. All of them shared the same expression of desperate resolve, the look of men who knew they were probably going to die, but who had chosen to die fighting rather than accept the humiliation of retreat. It was a courage that the knight could respect even as he prepared to kill them, a bravery that transcended nationality and spoke to something fundamental about the warrior's code that had shaped his own life. The English archers were ready, their bowstraves drawn to full extension, their arrows nocked and aimed at the struggling mass of French troops. But their quivers were lighter now, depleted by the volleys they had loosed in the earlier attacks. Each shaft had to count, each shot had to find its mark, because there might not be enough arrows left for the kind of sustained barrage that had broken the first 2 assaults. The knight could feel the tension in the English line, the awareness that this attack was different, more dangerous, more likely to reach them in significant numbers. The men around him checked their weapons one final time, adjusted their grips, settled into the fighting stances that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. They were professionals, but they were also human, and the prospect of hand-to-hand combat with desperate enemies was enough to tighten any man's stomach. King Henry's voice rang out across the field, clear and commanding despite the noise of the approaching French. The knight could not make out the individual words, but the tone was unmistakable, confident, inspiring, the voice of a leader who had never doubted the outcome of this battle. It was a voice that had carried them through the siege of Harfleur, through the grueling march across Normandy, through the long night of waiting that had preceded this day of reckoning. The first flight of arrows rose from the English line like a dark cloud against the grey sky, and the knight watched their flight with the professional interest of a man who had seen this sight many times before. But even as the shafts arced toward their targets, he could see that this volley was smaller than the previous ones, that the English were indeed running low on ammunition. The French had finally found an advantage, not through superior tactics or better equipment, but through the simple expedient of absorbing so much punishment that their enemies were running out of ways to inflict it. The arrows struck home with their familiar sound of impact and screams, but more French troops kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades, pressing forward through the killing ground with a determination that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. They had learned to accept casualties as the price of closing with their enemies, had finally grasped that the only way to neutralize English archery was to get close enough to make it irrelevant. The knight raised his sword as the first French men-at-arms reached the English line, their approach heralded by the clash of steel on steel and the grunts and curses of men engaged in mortal combat. These were not the exhausted, disorganized survivors of cavalry charges, but fresh troops who had advanced on foot, who had conserved their strength for the final melee, who understood that this was their last chance to salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. The fighting was more intense than anything the knight had experienced in the earlier phases of the battle. The French came on in waves, each group of attackers replaced by another as soon as they fell, their assault sustained by a seemingly inexhaustible supply of men willing to die for their cause. The English line bent under the pressure but did not break, held together by discipline and training and the mutual dependence that had been forged through years of campaigning together. The knight found himself engaged with a succession of French opponents, each fight brief but vicious, each victory followed immediately by another challenge. His sword work was economical and precise, the product of decades of experience and training. But even he could feel the strain beginning to tell. His armor, which had seemed so light at the beginning of the day, now felt like a crushing weight. His breathing was labored, his movements slightly slower than they had been hours earlier. Around him, other English men-at-arms were showing similar signs of fatigue. The young knight who had been wounded in the first assault was back in the line, his left arm still useless, but his right hand steady on his sword. An older sergeant whose grey beard showed beneath his helmet was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but his stance remained solid, his weapon ready. These were the moments that separated veterans from novices, not the grand gestures of individual combat, but the quiet determination to keep fighting when every muscle ached and every breath was an effort. The French were paying a terrible price for their persistence. The muddy ground before the English line was carpeted with their dead and wounded, a testament to the effectiveness of English tactics and the courage of French soldiers who had kept coming, despite the mounting evidence that their cause was hopeless. But they were also achieving something that their earlier attacks had not. They were forcing the English to fight at close quarters, negating the advantage of the longbow, turning the battle into the kind of brutal melee where individual skill and determination could make a difference. The knight parried a thrust from a French nobleman whose elaborate armor marked him as a man of considerable wealth and status. The Frenchman's technique was polished and precise, his movements economical despite his obvious exhaustion. This was no desperate peasant or half-trained levy, but a professional warrior whose skill matched his own. Their blades met and parted in a deadly dance that had been choreographed by years of training and refined by the immediate necessity of survival. The fight lasted longer than most, both men too experienced to make the kind of mistake that would end it quickly. They circled each other in the limited space available, their weapons probing for openings, their eyes locked in the kind of mutual assessment that came naturally to veteran fighters. The Frenchman was skilled, but he was also tired, his movements just slightly slower than they should have been, his recovery from each attack fractionally delayed by fatigue and the treacherous footing. The end came suddenly, as it often did in such encounters. The French knight's foot slipped in the mud, throwing him slightly off balance, and the English knight's blade found the gap between breastplate and helmet with surgical precision. The Frenchman went down without a sound, his blood mixing with the rain and mud that had already claimed so many others, his death unmarked except by the knight who stepped over his body and looked for the next threat. But there were fewer threats now. The French assault was finally beginning to weaken, their reserves exhausted, their casualties mounting beyond any reasonable hope of success. Individual French knights still fought with magnificent courage, but they were isolated now, cut off from support, facing enemies who had held their ground through the worst that France could throw at them. The knight could see King Henry in the thick of the fighting, his royal surcoat now torn and stained, but his sword arm still strong. The king was engaged with a massive French man-at-arms, whose size and strength made him a formidable opponent even under these conditions. But Henry's technique was flawless, his movements economical and precise, and the fight ended with the Frenchman on his knees in the mud, Henry's blade at his throat. It was then that the rumor began to spread through the English ranks, a whisper that grew into a shout, a fear that crystallized into panic. The French were attacking the baggage train, slaughtering the boys and servants who had been left to guard the supplies. Worse, there were reports of a fresh French force approaching from the rear, threatening to trap the English army between two enemies and turn victory into catastrophe. The knight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with the prospect of being surrounded, cut off from retreat, forced to fight to the death with no hope of escape. He had been in such situations before, had felt the peculiar clarity that came when all options were reduced to the simple choice between killing and dying. But this felt different, more final, as if the very ground beneath his feet was shifting to accommodate some new and terrible reality. King Henry's response was swift and decisive, but it is also controversial in ways that would echo through history. Faced with the prospect of a renewed French attack, while holding hundreds of prisoners who might turn against their captors if the battle were renewed, he made a choice that spoke to the brutal pragmatism that had carried him this far. "Kill the prisoners," the order came, passed from captain to captain, from knight to knight, spreading through the English ranks like wildfire. The knight heard it with a mixture of understanding and revulsion, recognizing the tactical necessity while recoiling from the human cost. These were not faceless enemies, but men he had fought and defeated, warriors whose courage he had witnessed firsthand, nobles whose ransoms could have made him wealthy. The English knights and men-at-arms were initially reluctant to follow the order, their hesitation born not of squeamishness, but of economic calculation. A live prisoner, especially a noble one, represented potential wealth that could transform a man's circumstances. To kill such valuable captives went against every instinct that had been developed through years of professional warfare. But Henry reiterated the command, his voice carrying the absolute authority of kingship and the immediate necessity of survival. The reports from the baggage train were confirmed. French raiders had indeed slaughtered the English boys and servants, violating the customs of war that normally protected non-combatants. The threat of a fresh French attack remained real, and the prisoners represented a danger that could not be ignored. The knight found himself standing over a young French nobleman whose elaborate armor and rich surcoat marked him as a man of considerable value. The boy, for he was little more than that, looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of noble breeding and warrior training. He would have made a fine ransom, enough to fund new equipment, perhaps even a small estate. The sword stroke was quick and clean, a professional courtesy that ended the boy's life without unnecessary suffering. The knight felt no satisfaction in the act, only the grim recognition that war had its own logic, its own necessities that transcended individual preference or moral qualm. The age of chivalry was indeed dying in the mud of Agincourt, and this was simply one more nail in its coffin. The slaughter of the prisoners was brief, but thorough, carried out with the same professional efficiency that had characterized the entire English performance. It was a dark moment in a day that had already seen too much darkness, but it was also a practical response to an immediate threat. The knight understood the necessity, even as he regretted the waste, the loss of potential wealth, and the violation of customs that had governed warfare for generations. The threatened French attack never materialized. Whether it had been a false alarm or whether the sight of English ruthlessness had discouraged the would-be attackers, the knight never learned. What mattered was that the immediate crisis had passed, that the English army remained intact and victorious, that the gamble Henry had taken in marching to Calais had paid off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The knight looked out over the field that had been transformed from a simple stretch of farmland into a monument to the changing nature of warfare. The dead lay thick upon the ground, their bright surcoats now stained with mud and blood, their proud banners trampled into the earth. It was a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come, but it was also a sight that marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. The French had lost more than a battle at Agincourt. They had lost their faith in the supremacy of traditional cavalry, their confidence in the invincibility of noble blood, their belief that individual prowess could overcome tactical innovation and professional discipline. The flower of French chivalry lay dead in the mud, and with them died a way of life that had dominated European warfare for centuries. For the English, and for the knight in particular, the victory represented validation of everything they had worked to achieve. The professional army had proven its worth, the new tactics had demonstrated their effectiveness, and the investment in training and equipment had paid dividends that would reshape the balance of power in Europe. The knight had been part of something larger than himself, something that would echo through history long after his own name was forgotten. As the sun set over the battlefield of Agincourt, The knight cleaned his blade one final time and sheathed it with the satisfaction of a job well done. He had survived another battle, had proven his worth once again, had earned his place in the ranks of those who would carry the memory of this day forward into an uncertain future. The silver of his armor caught the last rays of sunlight as he turned away from the field of slaughter, his footsteps already carrying him toward whatever challenges lay ahead. Behind him, the dead bore silent witness to the truth that he had always known, that in war, as in life, it was not the strongest or the bravest who survived, but those who adapted most quickly to the changing nature of the world around them. The Battle of Agincourt was over, but the knight's story would continue, carrying him forward through the years and decades to come, through other battles and other victories, through the slow transformation of medieval warfare into something recognizably modern. He had been present at a turning point in history, had played his part in the great drama that was reshaping Europe, and that knowledge would sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead. The age of the professional soldier had begun, and he was its living embodiment, scarred but unbroken, tested but not found wanting, ready for whatever the future might bring.